Mr. Speaker.
Order. Questions for all answer. Dr. Tan Boo Ming.
Question 1.
Mr. Speaker, sir, aside from Dr. Tan's question, Member Ms. Joan Pereira had filed a similar question yesterday, and Mr. Gerald Giam had also filed a PQ on this matter. So with your permission, may I take all these questions related to MAS's recent announcement on the SMS one-time password fraud at the same time?
Yes, please.
Sir, MAS, the Infocom Media Development Authority, or IMDA, and the Singapore Police Force announced on 15 September that malicious actors overseas had diverted and used SMS OTPs to perform fraudulent credit card transactions between September and December 2020. 75 bank customers in Singapore had been affected. Banks have reached out to all the affected customers to waive the unauthorized transactions amounting to approximately $500,000. There have been no confirmed cases of SMS OTP diversion in Singapore prior to September 2020. Banks are also reviewing all card dispute cases reported to them from September 2020 to identify if there may be other fraudulent transactions that were enabled by SMS OTP diversion. Banks will similarly investigate any new reports by customers, including any such transactions before September 2020. Bank customers will not have to bear any unauthorized charges in cases which are confirmed to have been enabled by SMS OTP diversion, as long as customers had taken care to protect their card information and authentication credentials. So bank customers will not have to bear any such unauthorized charges, so long as they had taken care to protect their card information and authentication credentials. So this attack has shown us that the fight against scams and fraud requires collective effort. Banks have a responsibility to secure their IT systems, put in place robust measures to authenticate customer transactions, and conduct active surveillance to detect unusual transaction patterns. They are required to institute robust security controls to safeguard customers' account information and transaction data from unauthorized access and misuse. Likewise, bank customers have a responsibility to protect their online banking and payment credentials for authentication, such as passwords and OTPs, by inputting them only on official websites or mobile applications. These should never be disclosed over the phone, via text message, or via email. Mr. Giam had asked about the measures taken by banks and telecommunication companies to safeguard against the SMS OTP diversion attack. While bank systems were secure and not the cause of these incidents, banks have further enhanced their fraud surveillance measures. This includes rejecting card payments made to common merchants linked to the unauthorized transactions. Banks will continue to closely monitor the evolving cybersecurity landscape and regularly review authentication mechanisms and other security measures put in place to address risk posed to customers using online financial services. As for the local telecommunication networks, IMDA, in consultation with the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, has required telco operators to put in place specialized firewalls and system safeguards to monitor and block suspicious diversions of SMS. As Ms. Pereira highlighted, consumers also need to take action to protect themselves. Allow me to share a few actions which consumers can focus on. First, consumers must assume that criminals will try to obtain their online banking credentials. Criminals typically do this by tricking consumers into installing malware on their devices or disclosing their online banking username and passwords through phone calls or fake websites. So when in doubt, consumers should call the bank's official hotlines to verify the legitimacy of requests for online banking and card credentials. Banks work with the Singapore Police Force, the National Crime Prevention Council, and MoneySense, our national financial education program, to regularly alert consumers to new methods adopted by scammers and to educate consumers on how they can protect themselves. Consumers must also develop a healthy skepticism about websites, unsolicited phone calls, messages, and emails. When making online purchases, they only should use established and reputable online services. If there is any doubt about a merchant's legitimacy, do not proceed with the transaction, and be wary of any deal or offer that sounds too good to be true. Second, consumers should set transaction notification thresholds at low levels so that unauthorized transactions are detected early. Banks work closely with the police force and anti-scam center to exchange intelligence on emerging scam trends so that they can take prompt action. The sooner a report is made, the higher the likelihood that funds can be recovered. Where bank customers suffer financial losses from fraudulent transactions, they are protected as long as they have acted responsibly. Banks are expected to consider whether the customers could have taken reasonable steps to prevent the occurrence of the fraudulent transactions. Bank customers will not have to incur any losses which arise from the bank's non-compliance with MAS's rules. Let me reiterate that fighting fraud is a collective effort, as criminals will continue to perpetuate new and more sophisticated methods to defraud consumers, banks, consumers, and consumers. To defraud consumers, banks, consumers, and the authorities will need to remain vigilant in preventing as well as detecting fraudulent transactions. MAS will continue to work with all stakeholders to ensure that e-payments remain safe and secure.
Dr. Tan Wu Meng.
I thank the Minister for his answer. Sir, these are serious revelations. A Clementi resident told me that when he disputed a credit card transaction with his bank, he was told because there's an OTP record in his phone number's name, the transaction must be genuine and therefore cannot be challenged. He appealed a number of times, the case was resolved, but how many more consumers would have given up before attaining a resolution? Sir, I've got 3 supplementary questions for the Minister. First, prior to September 2020, how many reports were there of fraudulent card transactions in recent years where the victims said they did not perform the transaction nor receive the SMS OTP? Has the trend been going up prior to the latest findings? Second, will MAS consider looking into these earlier cases too? Cases which, based on earlier assumptions, might have been deemed clear-cut, open and shut, but given the latest revelations might warrant repeat scrutiny. And thirdly, can MAS reassure the public, including our Clementi residents, that agencies will continue keeping an open mind when a customer is concerned about cyber fraud affecting their credit card, involving the SMS OTP password? Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in my reply just now, we have not seen any confirmed cases of SMS OTP diversion. I emphasize we're talking about SMS OTP diversion fraud cases. We have not seen any such, any confirmed cases up to now prior to September, but the banks, as I mentioned just now too, are investigating any further reports by consumers and customers, and this will include transactions that occurred before September 2020, taking into consideration this new revelation or this new finding that some of these SMS OTPs could have been diverted, and will take that into consideration in resolving these cases. And certainly, if any subsequent reports were to be made and found to be linked to SMS OTP diversion, the cases will be resolved as with the 75 cases that I highlighted, which means that affected customers will not have, the banks will waive the unauthorized transactions so long as the customers have taken the necessary care to protect the card information and authentication credentials. Going forward, reviewing future cases, whether it is due to SMS OTP diversion or other fraudulent methods. I have mentioned before in this House that we have a payments council. They are reviewing guidelines and responsibilities for customers as well as financial institutions to clarify responsibilities and liabilities. Ultimately, everyone needs to play their part. Financial institutions will have to do so, customers will have to do so. And if we clarify what the responsibilities and guidelines are, then hopefully we can continue collectively to do more to guard against such fraudulent transactions. Thank you, sir.
Here again.
Thank the Minister for answering my questions. Given that SMS diversion is something that takes place overseas where MAS has no jurisdiction, how are the banks going to prevent this from happening to their customers again? For example, are banks or IMDA going to work with these overseas telcos to close these loopholes? Secondly, will MAS be directing banks to move their multi-factor authentication methods away from SMS to more secure, for example, app-based authentication methods? If so, how will they ensure that the less tech-savvy customers will not be left out? And lastly, can MAS also require banks to allow customers, existing customers, to disable SMS multi-factor authentication for their own accounts and then use app-based authentication instead because that's more secure?
So let me just take these three questions in turn. First, as I mentioned in my reply, IMDA is putting in place some safeguards with regard to how the telcos operate. In this instance, where it comes to SMS diversion, obviously the perpetrators needed to do several things. Number one, they would have obtained the victim's personal and financial information and mobile phone number already, right? So that would have been compromised already through malware, through phishing, whatever methods they would have gotten that information. Second, the perpetrators would have gained access to a few overseas telco networks to compromise their system. Then they would fraudulently modify the location details of the targeted victims, as though these victims were overseas. Then you make a transaction, and the bank sends an SMS OTP to this overseas network, through this overseas network, and that's how the transaction, with the compromised credit card credentials, the fraudulent transaction is made. And so, as I mentioned just now, IMDA is already putting in place additional safeguards to, for example, check how information from the telcos are put out, to have specialized firewalls, to have system safeguards to monitor and block suspicious diversions of SMS. This would include, for example, knowing where an individual's location is, and if you suddenly see the change in location, a red flag may be triggered, and then the telco would then have safeguards in place to prevent the SMS from being diverted. So these system safeguards are being worked on by IMDA. On the second question about, sorry, can you repeat the second question?
Asking the banks to use other forms of authentication besides SMS.
Thank you. Other forms of authentication, whether you can allow customers to opt out. MAS indeed doesn't prescribe. We do not, the financial institutions are required to implement multi-factor authentication mechanisms. It can include SMS OTP, but they can include other forms of multi-factor authentication. Each one, will potentially be susceptible to perpetrators trying to take advantage of any possible weakness. So It's a continuous process where the financial institutions have to review the type of authentication mechanism which they would like to use, commensurate with the risk level of the financial transaction and the sensitivity of the data involved. As for allowing options for customers, it's something that MES can engage the banks on to see if the banks would be prepared to give more options for customers who feel that they would prefer something more secure. But I must say it's not as though you can find, whatever you put in place, the perpetrators will always be looking out for new ways to identify vulnerabilities and weaknesses. So this has to be a continuous effort to make sure that our systems remain secure, and it requires continued vigilance by regulator, financial institutions, and customers, importantly.